All right, we're ready for Isaiah chapters 36 to 39. And that in our outline is listed as a historical interlude concerning Hezekiah. And not only is it a historical interlude, but it will finish this first section, first half of the book. By half, I'm talking about by number, not so much number of chapters as first half in the outline. And so chapters 1 to 39 deals with judgment from God, the Assyrian period, conflict and victory. We've looked at prophecy against Judah and Jerusalem, prophecy against the nations, the world judgment and deliverance of God's people, a summary of the nations section. And then we finished last time the woes about the sins of the people. And now we have this historical interlude. And that's quite interesting because of the parallel accounts to that we'll get to in just a second. There are two major thoughts in that section. There's the victory over Assyria that is the focal point of chapters 36 and 37. And then there is the sin that Hezekiah committed in his dealings with Babylon. And that's in 38 and 39. Now, this historical interlude, let's talk about where it fits. We talked earlier in our studies about the kings that are mentioned in chapter 1 and in verse 1 that Hezekiah, in the time of Hezekiah. So once again, I love this graph because it lists the kings and the number of years that they served. So in looking at this graph here, we start off with the United Kingdom period, and now we have then the divided kingdom, and this is Israel and their kings, and this is Judah and their kings. As you go on down through time, you come down to this period of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, and that's the period in which Isaiah fits. It is thought historically that Manasseh was the one that killed Isaiah and cut him in two with a wooden saw. And so we talk about 4 to 5 kings in the period in the life and the work of Isaiah. But 4 of those are mentioned right here in chapter 1 in verse 1 of the book of Isaiah, and that's Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So we're talking tonight about Hezekiah. So we're down here at this part of the work of Isaiah, toward the end of his work, or at least the last king in Isaiah's work, if we accept or make an exception to Manasseh. And then beyond that, there were more kings in Judah. We're not at the end of the southern kingdom after Manasseh. Then you have Ammon, Josiah, etc., on down to Zedekiah. Then you have Babylonian captivity. Now, we'll say more about that captivity in just a moment. Here's what happens tonight in our study. I call this section Hezekiah's dealing with Assyria and with Babylon. There is the threat of Assyria under Sennacherib, the leader. Then there is a threat toward the end with reference to Babylon. As Babylon reaches out to Hezekiah, as he's recovered from his illness, they have a political goal in mind, and we'll talk about what that is a little bit later, and we'll see his sin with reference to Babylon in chapter 39. So here are the 4 things we're going to see. I divided this section into 4 sections. It's actually, we could group 36 and 37 as we did in our greater outline together, and 38 and 39 together, but I've listed them as 4 here and in the workbook. And so we have in chapter 36, Sennacherib's arrogant threat against Judah. And then after that, you see in chapter 37, God defends Jerusalem because of Hezekiah's righteous plea. And we're going to see God's promise, I'm going to take care of Assyria, and I'm going to defend Jerusalem. And you're going to see that 2 or 3 times in our study. Then in chapter 38, we see Hezekiah's sickness and his life is extended for 15 years, and then his sin with Babylon. That's where we're going in our study. So if you don't have this written down in the margin of your text, I encourage you to get a pencil. Let's take a few moments and write down in 3 different places parallel accounts. So you might write, before you leave Isaiah 36 to 39, you might write that there is a parallel account in 2 Kings 18 to 20. We're going to go over there in a minute. So don't jump over there just yet. Write down these passages because that'll help you in future studies of Isaiah, if you don't already have that the parallel account to this, chapter 36 to 39, is 2 Kings 18 to 20. And also 2 Chronicles 32. Are there other outlying verses besides those? Yes, but this gets to the heart of what is parallel. All right? Now let's turn over to 2 Kings, if you will, chapter 18. And we don't have time in our study tonight to go through all of that. I found it interesting to go back today and read 18 to 20 a time or two and see what might be there that's not found in the Isaiah account. But what I would encourage you to do at 2 Kings chapter 18 is, make a marginal note somewhere, that chapters 18 to 20, the parallel account is Isaiah 36 to 39 and 2 Chronicles 32. So that when you go back to 2 Kings and study it again, you've got a marginal note that said, okay, Isaiah 39 is what's talking about this. Those marginal notes are very helpful. At least they are to me. They may not be as much to you. Now, while you're in 2 Kings 18, before we leave that, we're going to go to 2 Chronicles in a minute. Let's kind of get a gist of what we see here. You see that Hezekiah becomes king, and we see beginning at verse 3 of chapter 18, he did what was right. But I want you to notice at verse 7, he rebelled against Assyria. We'll come back to that a little bit later. But then much of the same story that we see in Isaiah is going to be retold right here in chapters 18, 19, and also into chapter 20. Now we'll call attention to those parallels a little bit later when we need to enhance our understanding. Now let's go over to 2 Chronicles chapter 32 and go over there and do a couple of things, and then we'll not waste time, but not take any more time on the parallel passages until we need to come to them. But go to 2 Chronicles 32 and make a marginal note that the parallel account is Isaiah 36 to 39 and 2 Kings 18 to 20. So we've got all three passages tied together, at least in our marginal notes. Now there is some information in 2 Chronicles 32 that's not found in either of the cases of 2 Kings or Isaiah 36. And I'll call your attention to that later, but if you want to mark it for now, verses 3 to 8 is not found in either of those accounts. And verse 18 gives us some information that's not found. And also verse 30 gives us some information that's not found. And so verses 3 to 8, 18, and 30 gives us more information than is found in either one of the accounts of 2 Kings or Isaiah chapter 36. All right, with that in mind, let's get underway now. Let's talk about chapter 36, Sennacherib's arrogant threat against Judah. Sennacherib's arrogant threat against Judah. Now, with this chapter, we begin this historical section that I call simply the historical interlude concerning Hezekiah. And much of the events of these chapters, with an exception or two that we'll get to a little bit later, occurred in 701 BC in Sennacherib's invasion. Keep in mind, Isaiah was never intended to be a truly chronological book, and much of the Bible was never intended to be a truly chronological book. Sometimes the story is being told, whereas you might tell a story about something and you tell something that happened later first, and something that happened first, you tell it later. And so does Isaiah do that, because he's putting the storyline together, not so much a chronology together. And we'll see a little bit of that when we get to chapters 38 and 39. But be that as it may, let's start with this verse 1. Sennacherib is the king of Assyria. And so Sennacherib takes some fortified cities in Judah. Let's get that at verse 1. That it came to pass in the 14th year of the king Hezekiah that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against the fortified cities of Judah, and he took them. Well, Wayne Jackson suggests in his work on the book of Isaiah that he took some 46 cities and took over 200,000 prisoners. In other words, this was quite a significant take. He hasn't taken Jerusalem. He hasn't caused Judah to fall, as he will take Israel to fall. He hasn't done that yet, but he has made some headway and shaking and rattling the cage, so to speak, concerning Judah. Now, beginning at verse 2, we see Rabshakeh's, or Rabshakeh, I think is the way it's supposed to be pronounced, challenge to Judah. Now, who or what is Rabshakeh? Rabshakeh simply is not a proper name. It's not that someone named Rabshakeh went, but it simply stands for the chief officer. Some want to render that chief of staff or something similar to that. It seemed to be a chief officer, maybe a general, what we might think of as a general, or just some top leader, a minister of defense, whatever you want to call it, but some chief official from the emperor or the king. That's all we're interested in, is that he is a designated ambassador or leader. But the Rabshakeh comes, and what he does in verses 4 to 6 now, let's start at verse 2 and notice what he does. And then the king of Syria sent the Rabshakeh to Lachish. And he stood there at the aqueduct of the upper pool, And he met with some delegates from King Hezekiah that are mentioned at verse 3, Shebna and Eliakim and Joah. So he met with those representatives of the king Hezekiah, and notice now beginning at verse 14. Verse 4, that he begins to now raise the question, do you trust in Egypt? Now, I meant to go back. I want to go back just for a moment to 2 Kings. Hold your finger there. I want to go back to 2 Kings and establish something here before we get any further. Go back to 2 Kings 18. Why is this going on with this sending of Sennacherib coming in and taking the fortified cities, and then this challenge to Judah? Why is he doing that? And why is there this back and forth between Hezekiah and the king of Assyria? Well, let's go to chapter 18 of 2 Kings, and I want you to notice that Hezekiah rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. They had been serving him before, but they're not serving him now. In what sense? And how? Well, perhaps not paying tribute as they had been. Others have suggested that as he is living right and trying to do what's right, he's cutting out the idolatry, which was a form of denial of the king of Assyria, that he's not bowing to their pressure. But then there's something else I want you to notice as you turn over to 2 Chronicles 32. I said we'd come back, and I should have already done this, but notice back in 2 Chronicles 32, this is what's not mentioned in the other accounts, that King Hezekiah also did this somewhere in the midst, that as there is an advance toward Jerusalem, he cuts off the waterways that go outside the city. And I'm not going to read all of that, but he stopped all the springs and the brooks so that he said, why should the king of Assyria come here and find much water? He comes here closer to us, and I don't want him to find any water, so he stops all the water ducts so that consequently he doesn't get any water. So he strengthened himself, and he repaired the Milo, which is some kind of fortress, according to the ISBE. And he strengthened the people and said at verse 8 that with him, that is Assyria, is the arm of the flesh, but with us is the Lord our God. So let's fight against him and we can rebel. So he's rebelling against him. All right, now back to Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 36, beginning at verse 4, the Rabshakeh ridicules the king of Judah, Hezekiah, and basically asks at verse 4 beginning, where are you going to put your confidence and your trust? He says at verse 5 that you talk about the strength of war. That's what you're telling your people, and that's all a bunch of vain words. I'm paraphrasing verse 5. And he says, are you putting your trust in the broken reed of Egypt? Yeah, they had been, is the answer to that. But are you putting your confidence in Egypt? And then he ridicules that by saying that he's a staff of a broken reed, that if a man leans on it, it pierces his hands. You're leaning on Egypt like leaning on a cane that's about to snap and it's going to drive through your hand. It's a worthless support that you're getting from Egypt. They're not going to be any help to you. Is that what you're trusting in? You better just bow down to the pressure and submit to me, and I'm going to take you. That's what he's saying. All right, that gets us through verse 6. Beginning at verse 7, Rabshakeh asked if he trusted in the Lord to save him. Are you trusting in Egypt? All right. Well, maybe you're trusting in the Lord. So beginning at verse 7, he said, but if you say we will trust the Lord our God, he said, is it not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has taken away and said to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar? That shows the ignorance, and here's something practical. The world is often ignorant of what's going on among God's people. Shows the ignorance of the king of Assyria. He thought that when Hezekiah is taking out the idolatry, he's taking out the worship places of the one true and living God. And that's not so. But it shows his ignorance of that. He was totally ignorant of what's going on in Israel and what's going on in Judah. So he said at verse 9 or verse 8, he said, now therefore I urge you, give a pledge to my master, the king of Assyria, and I'll give you 2,000 horses. That is, and here's some ridicule, he said, if you're able to put riders on them. In other words, notice, are you trusting in Egypt? Egypt is a worthless reed. Are you trusting in God? Well, remember, y'all got rid of the altars to your God. Remember that? So that ain't going to work either if you're putting your trust in God. What I want to tell you need to do is you need to put your trust and confidence in our king and submit to the king. And if you do that, we'll give you 2,000 horses. That is, if y'all got enough soldiers to mount up on those horses. That's a dig and a ridicule, obviously. All right, now that gets us down through verse 10. Now, the Rabshakeh's challenge to the people, verses 11 to 20, this gets quite interesting to me when we look at the parallel account, and we'll come to that here in just a minute, over in 2 Chronicles. Now, at verse, I want you to notice something, though, at verse, starting at verse 7. Is where I want us to start. He said, but if you say you trust in the Lord, we talked about the high places. I want you to notice at the end of verse 10, that's what I'm looking for. The Lord said to me, go up against the land and destroy it. Now this is Rabshakeh, that is the chief of staff or general, whoever that might be. The chief leader for the king says, I'm speaking for the king, and God sent me up against you. Well, that was true. But he's got no way of knowing that because God hadn't told there's no record that God has told Assyria, I'm using you. But that is a true statement that God has sent me up against you and go destroy the land. Well, he has the idea of completely destroying it. Now let's talk about this challenge to the people. The Rabshakeh talks to the delegation. Are you trusting in Egypt? Are you trusting in your God? Let's make a deal. And so he challenged to the people. So they holler out to the people that could be heard nearby on the wall. And what do they say? Well, Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah ask the Rabshakeh, speak to us in Aramaic language, and we understand that, but don't speak in Hebrew in the hearing of the people on the wall. In other words, we don't want to upset the people on the wall. Let's keep our delegation and our negotiation going here in a language where they won't understand. Then the Rabshakeh stood at verse 13 and called out with a loud voice in Hebrew and said, hear the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. Let's turn over to 2 Chronicles 32 just for a moment and look at verse 8. I said there was some information there that wasn't found. And the text says there that they shouted out to frighten them and to trouble them that they might take the city. That was the purpose of that. You don't want us to talk where the people can hear? We'll shout where the people can hear, and we'll do it in the Hebrew voice where they understand. And the motive was we'll frighten them and excite them and get them all disturbed, and maybe they will encourage you to submit to us. So here's what they say. Look at verse 14 and 15. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he'll not deliver you, nor let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord. Don't let him lead you to trust in the Lord, and don't let him tell you that the Lord will deliver you, and he will not deliver, the Lord will surely deliver you. This city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. That's what he'll try to tell you. And don't you listen to Hezekiah. All right, now beginning at verse 16. Make peace with Assyria by giving tribute. What you need to do is come peacefully and submit to us. Make peace with us and come out to me. And notice their reasoning. See if this doesn't sound familiar. And I'm going to paraphrase, but notice the wording back up at verse 12. Their reference to the people on the wall, those people that will eat and drink their own waste with you. In other words, if they listen to Hezekiah, it's going to be so bad, these people in the city of Jerusalem are going to be eating their own waste. Saying that for the benefit of the people in the city. Then they say, but if you come with us, look at verse 17. It'll be like a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards. You'll drink waters from your own cistern, verse 16. Now you think if you were in the city and you're hearing this other nation threat and said, if you don't submit to us, you're going to be eating your own waste. But if you submit to us, you're going to have it better, and you're going to have the best of food, the best of luxury. It's going to be great. It's going to be great. You just come with us. Satan works that way. All right. Now, I want you to notice now, the third thing they say in this challenge is the other gods did not save their people, neither will Jerusalem's gods. Well, that sounds reasonable if you are a heathen. So notice what they say beginning. He said, behold, lest Hezekiah persuade you, saying, the Lord will deliver us. Has any of the gods of the nations delivered its land into the hand of the king of Assyria? And the answer to that's no. And he starts naming some. Where are the gods of Hamath or Arpad? And so on down the line. Where are these gods? Well, they didn't deliver their nations and take Assyria and defeat Assyria. Assyria was stronger than their gods, and Assyria is stronger than your God too. All right. Now, notice in verse 21 and verse 22. Well, let's get verse 20. The Lord, who among the gods of the land has delivered his countries, and that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem from my hand. Jerusalem is going to be taken. Let's get 21 and 22 to finish this chapter. Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah's reaction to that. In other words, they were the delegation sent out by Hezekiah. You go out and talk to the chief of staff of the king and see what he says. And so he's threatening the people, ridicules, and here was their reaction, 21 and 22. Notice carefully. They held their peace and answered him not a word. And why did they do that? Because the king had said, don't answer a word. Don't say anything. And so they came back with their clothes torn and told the words of the Rabshakeh. In other words, they were distraught by that. They're bothered by his threats. And they come back and tell the king, we've got some problems here. And here's the threat. So that's Sennacherib's arrogant threat against Judah. Sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? Sounds pretty bad. All right, let's move on to chapter 37 now. In chapter 37, God defends Jerusalem because of Hezekiah's righteous plea. God defends Jerusalem because of Hezekiah's righteous plea. So let's see what happens here. Now, remember, he's already taken some 46 fortified cities, given this great challenge, and they haven't said a word. They haven't responded. Hezekiah hasn't responded yet, nor has his representatives responded yet. So what do? Let's begin at chapter 37, verse 1. Verse 1 said, and so it was that when the king Hezekiah heard it, that he tore his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and went to the house of the Lord. Two things are implied, I think, from that. Number one is mourning, sackcloth, covering himself with sackcloth, tearing his clothes. And so he's mourning over this, but going to the house of God implies to me that he went and spent some time in prayer. And so why would I even think that? Well, that's one of the reasons you'd go to the house of God. And the other is the fact that he was a praying person, as we see in 2 Kings 18 to 20. We see that in 2 Chronicles 32, and we see it right here in this whole section. We're going to see more about that here in a moment. All right. So Hezekiah, now beginning at verse 2, having apparently prayed, verse 1, he sends messengers to Isaiah. Let's go to the prophet and find out what we should do. So let's look at verses 2 to 5 now. That he sent Eliakim and Shebna and the elders of the priest and covered with sackcloth to Isaiah the prophet. And they said to Hezekiah, this day is a day of trouble and rebuke and blasphemy. Now notice this wording, and you got a question in your handout about this. For the children have come to birth, but there is no strength to bring them forth. It gives me the picture of Judah and Hezekiah as the leader being worn down. If you can imagine a woman ready to give birth, but she's so wore out and has no energy, she doesn't have the strength to give birth to the child. We've come to the point of giving birth and we can't do it. In other words, we've fought and we've resisted, and look how strong the threat is. And it's like a woman trying to give birth. I don't know. I just don't know if we can do it. I don't know. And it may be that the Lord will hear the words of the Rabshakeh, whom the master of Assyria has sent, and that the Lord has heard, therefore lift up your prayers for the remnant that is left. And so there's the encouragement of prayer. That gets us through verse 5. So Hezekiah sends messengers, and they're asking Hezekiah, here's the problem, Hezekiah. Would you pray to God for us, and would you encourage prayer, that there might be prayer, that there may be an answer? Now, verses 6 and 7 gives us some assurance. That Isaiah said to them, thus shall you say to the master, do not be afraid of the words which you have heard, which your servant the king of Assyria has blasphemed me. Well, that tells me something. God, through the prophet, viewed the words of the Syrian king as not blasphemy against Judah, but blasphemy against him. And if you're standing for the truth and someone is blaspheming you, they're really blaspheming God, is the point to be learned from that. And here's what God says about that. He said, surely I'll send a spirit upon him, and he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. I'm going to bring the Syrian king down. So don't worry about the threat he's making about taking Jerusalem. He's not going to take Jerusalem. He's not going to do that. I'm going to take care of the king. Here's your assurance. Well, we're not through with the threats. So let's begin at verse 8, and we have Sennacherib's threatening letter and Hezekiah's response to that. So let's start at verses 8 and go through verse 13. Now here is the Rabshakeh returned, that is, the chief of staff goes back, and he returns and he finds the king warring at Libnah. That's some 25 miles west of Jerusalem. He's off warring over there. Now what's going on here? Well, the king had heard concerning the king of Ethiopia that he's come out to make war with you. That was the rumor that he got, that Ethiopia is coming. Ethiopia would have been thought to be in alliance with Judah. And so he's hearing a threat, true or not, that Ethiopia is coming to fight against you. And so consequently, he said when he heard it, he sent messengers to Hezekiah. He kind of ramps up the efforts that I need to get Judah to bow to me and not fight against me. I need to get them under submission quick and soon. So that's the urgency of this next threat, verses 8 to 13. All right, let's see what that says. He said, thus shall you speak to Hezekiah, verse 10. Do not let your God in whom you trust say to you, Jerusalem shall be given to the hand of the king of Syria. In other words, don't listen to your God. That you've heard of what the king of Assyria has done on all the lands, utterly destroying them, and you will be delivered. Is that what you think? You see, we've been powerful in marching through and taking the nations. We'll take you too. And though he repeats then this point concerning the other gods, that the gods of the nations that we've destroyed, where are those gods? Where is the king of Hamath and the king of Arpad, and on down the line? Where are these kings and where are their gods? We took them all. Now notice that verse, so that was his threat again. So he just re-emphasizes what he's already done. That gets us through verse 13. Let's see Hezekiah's response beginning at verse 14. What does he say? How does he respond to that? Verses 14. Well, in verse 14, he first read the letter. He takes the letter, receives the letter in his hand, and he read it. And then Hezekiah went to the house of the Lord and spread it out before the Lord. 2 Kings, we're going back a little bit, not parallel exactly to this point, but back earlier than this in 2 Kings 18, Hezekiah is mentioned one who trusted in the Lord. He had great trust in the Lord, commended for his great trust in the Lord. And what I notice here is he doesn't call his chief of staff together and say, get the army ready, we got to fight. But the first thing he does is he takes the letter and spreads it out before the Lord, and he talks to the Lord about it. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, saying, here's what he says. Here's his prayer. O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, the one who dwells between the cherubim, you are God. Let me footnote to say, not only do we learn what he prayed, but we may learn some expressions that we could use in praise unto God. You are God, you alone, all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made the heaven and the earth. Incline your ear, O Lord, open your ears, O Lord, and see and hear all the words of Sennacherib, who has sent a reproach to the living God. Truly, Lord, the kings of Assyria have laid waste all the nations of the land, and have cast their gods into the fire, that before they were not gods, but the work of men's hands. In other words, they destroyed their gods because they were not true gods. Now verse 20. The same point's made in 2 Kings. Now therefore, O Lord, save us from his hand, that, here's the thing he pleads for, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you are the Lord, you alone. Now that's interesting. He doesn't just ask, Lord, save us that we might not suffer at the hand of the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, but save us from his hand so that all the kingdoms will know that you alone are Lord, that you are the one that is stronger than all the gods of all the nations. It's an interesting phrase. Seems to be worded a little stronger maybe in 2 Kings, very similar depending on your translation of that. All right, that gets us down through verse 20. Now let's see the Lord's response to Hezekiah's prayer. Now, keep in mind what's happened. The king is seeking assurance and from Isaiah, the prophet of the Lord through Isaiah the prophet, and he gets that assurance. And then here comes this threatening letter. So he goes back to the Lord and he prays to the Lord. Here's the Lord's response. Look at verse 21. Look at verse 21. Isaiah the son of Amos sent to Hezekiah, saying, Thus says the Lord God of Israel, because you have prayed to me against Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, this is the word which the Lord has spoken concerning him. And so he said, this message is coming in response to your prayer. And if I don't learn anything from tonight's lesson, I'm learning the power of prayer. I'm learning God hears the prayers of the righteous. I'm learning that God's ears are open to those who are righteous. 1 Peter 3:12 and other texts. So let's focus now 22 to 35 on the message from the Lord, and let's focus on that, and then we'll come back to that outline we just saw. There are 6 points in this message from the Lord. This was the response that the Lord gave to Hezekiah. 6 points. Here's the first. His first point was that, well, basically, and there's a question on this somewhere, I think. Your last box on page 1 of your handout. What I'm looking for is 2 things there. What was basically, not all 6 of these, but what 2 things do you see here? Well, we'll talk about those 2 things when I get through with these 6. Let's go through this. Now, first of all, Jerusalem's going to scorn Assyria. In other words, Assyria is scorning Jerusalem right now. But that's not the way it's going to be. So let's get this quickly. Let's notice he said, the virgin of the daughter of Zion has despised you and laughed you to scorn. The daughter of Jerusalem has shaken her head behind your back. In other words, they're going to be laughing at you like you're trying to laugh at them, because you're going to fall and they're going to stand. That was God's answer. So that should give assurance to Hezekiah. All right, let's go to verse 23 to 25. Assyria in her pride came against the Holy One. Look at verse 23. Whom have you reproached and blasphemed? Against whom have you raised your voice? Against, here you might underline, the Holy One of Israel. That's an expression used throughout the book of Isaiah. What you did, Assyria, is raise up against the Holy One of Israel. You've raised yourself up against God. And so when you said, this is Assyria speaking, that by the multitude of my chariots, I'm at verse 24, I have come up to the heights of the mountains, to the limits of Lebanon, and cut down the tall cedars. In other words, by our strength and our might and our power, we've come up against Jerusalem and Judah. He said, you arrogantly think you have power, but you don't. Now that gets us down through verse 20. Well, notice at verse 26. God reminded them that I made it, I formed it, I brought it to pass, that you should be for the crushing fortified cities into heaps of ruins. You might underline that phrase. God said it was by my power that I created everything. I made this nation. I created the world. I did everything by my power, by my might, that you, let's find that phrase again at verse 26, that you should be for the crushing fortified cities into heaps of ruins. You might make a marginal note. God was using them as a tool. And we see that all through the prophets. God uses a nation as a tool. And so when a nation thinks it's mighty and powerful, like the United States, we think we're mighty and powerful, got the greatest military on earth, and we're proud of that, and man, we are a powerful nation. If our nation's being used for something, God's using it as a tool. That's all we are. Tools are disposable, by the way. Tools are disposable. And God's going to make that clear. Now, beginning at verse 28, God's going to defeat Assyria. Look at verse 29. Because your rage against me and your tumult has come up to my ears, therefore I will put a hook in your nose and a bridle in your lips, and I will turn you back the way that you came. You think you're high and mighty? I'm going to put a hook in your nose. I'm going to put a bridle in your mouth. And I've got control of you, Assyria. I'm going to bring you down. I'm going to defeat you. Now, verse 30 to 32, the sign for the remnant. The sign is within 3 years, it would be seen that they're going to begin to fall. Because he talks about you'll eat, and then of the second year you'll eat, the first year and the second year and the third year. Within 3 years, we're going to see it begin to fall. And notice he mentions the remnant who have escaped from the house of Judah shall take root and downward and bear fruit upward. In other words, they're going to flourish. The remnant that's left, when you're gone, the remnant that's left is going to flourish. Now, God's going to defend Jerusalem. Let's get 33 to 35, and then we're about to finish this chapter so we can get the last 2 shorter chapters. And 32 to 35, 33 to 35, Thus says the Lord, what's he going to do? Well, let's get to 35, and that gets to the heart of no, let's go and get verse 33. Concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into the city. God allowed Sennacherib to get to the door of Jerusalem and shake the cage. But he said, you ain't going to go in the city. I ain't going to let it happen. And it didn't happen. And notice at verse 33, for I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for the sake and for my servant David's sake. God said, I'm going to spare Jerusalem. So what two things did I learn from this, what I was looking for in that last box? If you say, okay, what are we looking for if we're not looking for 6 things? I'm looking for the fact that God's going to defeat Assyria and he's going to defend Jerusalem. Defeat Assyria, defend Jerusalem. That's what God's going to do. And so Hezekiah prays to God. And God said, because you prayed, here's the answer I'm giving you. I'm going to bring Assyria down and I'm going to raise up my people and defend my people. Now, look at verse 36 to 38, the defeat of Assyrian army and Sennacherib. What happens? Then the angel of the Lord went out and killed the camp of the Assyrians, 185,000. The hand of the Lord was in that, obviously. So says the text. And the people arose and found corpses all dead. Found them dead. Then King Sennacherib departed and returned home. Went to Nineveh, capital city. And while he was worshiping his God, his sons came in with a sword and took his life. And he never made it to do what he threatened to do. He never made it inside Jerusalem to take Jerusalem. Which tells me he was just a tool. And God decided it was time to throw the tool away. If you're following the workbook, you might look at footnote number 8. Quotation from George Robinson in his work on Isaiah. He said this happened 20 years subsequent to the siege of Jerusalem, 681 BC. During all those years, Sennacherib never made another expedition into Palestine. Contemplate that for what that may be worth. All right. We only have a few minutes, so let's jump to chapter 38. This is a little more familiar to us, perhaps, than some of the other information. So we're going to quickly run through chapter 38 and 39. In chapter 38, what we have is Hezekiah's sickness and his life extended. Now, you've got a box on the back page. You can fill in this information. It's this exact same box with a few blanks on it about the timing of this, and that is Hezekiah reigned from 726 to 697 BC. He was thought to be 25 years old when he began to reign. Reigned for 29 years. We know that for a fact, which would have put him at 54. 15 years in this context were added to his life. That would put this 14th year in the 14th year of his reign, about 712 BC. That's why I mentioned a moment ago that this is not all true chronology in Isaiah 36 to 39, or the book of Isaiah for that matter. This would have been 11 years before the invasion of 701 that we've been talking about, and that would have put him about 39 years old when he got sick. Now, you can contemplate all of those numbers and copy those down and study those further. Let's work our way through chapter 38. Chapter 38, Hezekiah becomes sick, according to verses 1 to 8. And God said, and here's a very practical thing to contemplate, set your house in order, for you shall die and not live. Since none of us know when we'll die, that's a good admonition for all of us. Set your house in order. Get it in order. So that's what God told him. So Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and he prayed to the Lord and talked about remember how I've walked before you. And he wept bitterly, and the Lord sent the word through Isaiah, go and tell Isaiah that I have seen your tears and I have heard your prayers. I've added 15 years. Now, verse 6, we're looking for this, I think, somewhere in our handout. If not, you ought to look for this. Verse 6, that I will deliver you and this city from the hand of the king of Assyria. I'm going to deliver you from Assyria. This assurance is given 2 or 3 times in this context. And I will defend the city. This is what this book is about. Is God going to defend this city, or do we need to go to Egypt for help or Ethiopia for help? And here's the assurance time and again and again and again and again. I'm going to defeat Assyria and I'm going to defend the city. So God gave him that assurance. Now, let's talk about the message to Isaiah, through Isaiah to the prophet. Through the prophet to Hezekiah the king. He said, and this shall be a sign for you. Now, as a footnote, drop over. Notice I've put verse 21 and 22. Jump over and look at verses 22 and 21 and 22. Isaiah said, "Let them take a lump of figs and apply it as a poultice on the boil, and he shall recover." I don't take that as a medical or medicinal application as much as it's an act of obedience. Much like Naaman's dipping 7 times in Jordan to be cleansed of his leprosy. Just an act of obedience. Do this and you'll recover. And then Hezekiah said, what is the sign that I shall go up to the house of the Lord? It seems that verse 21 and 22 should fit between verses 6 and 7. You say, why? Because he asked for a sign, then the sign is given starting at verse 7, and that fits what seems to be a greater chronology in 2 Kings. It harmonizes with 2 Kings. So it seems that the point of verses 21 and 22 fit between 6 and 7. Might make a marginal note of that for future reference. But anyway, when he asked for the sign would be that 2 Kings, he was asked, do you want the sundial to go forward or backward? Well, going forward's not so bad, so it would be a greater challenge for it to go backward 10 degrees, and it did. That seemed to be a localized, as your footnote in the workbook, a localized refraction of light. And why you say it's localized and not a universal? Because in 2 Chronicles 32, there were those who came to Judah to see the wonder that had taken place in that land. So it seemed not to be a worldwide thing, but a thing that happened in the land of Judah, for whatever that may be worth to you. But anyway, he saw the sign. That indeed, that the sign was there, that he was not to, that he would live for 15 years. All right, that was the message given to him. Now, the rest of the chapter is about 2 things: the sadness of a premature death, and then him thanking God for extending his life. So, in the sadness of this premature death was that I'm not there to praise God. I can't praise God while I'm dead. The body can't praise God, at least. And I'm not among the land of the living, and I'm like the weaving on a loom that is taken out prematurely before it's finished. It's like a tent that wears out and is picked up and gone quickly. The tragedy of a premature death. At 39, that is a premature death. But then he thanks God that his life has been extended, and he praises God for that. Now, our time is about gone, but let's quickly get 39. There are only 8 verses in chapter 39. The king of Babylon now comes, sends a delegation to him. What's the purpose? It's not merely that he's interested, as you look at 2 Kings and harmonize that it doesn't seem to be that he's come just to wish him well. They bring gifts and come to him and wishing him well because you've been sick and I'm glad you're better, da-da-da-da-da. But it's trying to form an alliance against Assyria. Because they're going to ultimately fight against Assyria. Syria's a threat to Babylon right now until Assyria falls. And that seems to be the case. So what does Hezekiah do? When they come in, verses 1 and 2, he gets carried away and shows them all the glories of his kingdom and shows them all the gold and the silver and shows them everything he's got. And Isaiah then comes on the scene, verses 3 to 8, and asks him, and here's a very practical question, what have they seen in your house? Every preacher's built a sermon around that, I suppose. What have they seen in your house? But he's not asking what's going on in your family. That's how we generally apply that in a sermon. But what did you show them? And he said, I showed them everything. I showed them everything I had. All the gold and silver and everything. And he said, okay. And I'm paraphrasing. Isaiah said to him, you've shown them everything and they're going to take everything. And they're eventually going to take it all. In other words, this is a prophecy. You're looking for this in your handout. Of Babylonian captivity that comes around in 606 BC. Syria is the threat, but he's prophesying here of Babylonian captivity. Babylon's going to take every bit of that from you. It's all going to be taken. And so Hezekiah's response to that, and we'll end on this note, well, at least there's peace in my day. In other words, it's not he understood the prophecy. It's going to happen down the line, but at least there's peace in my day. And so the chapter's end. That's the historical interlude. Now, next week we begin a new thought and a whole new section, a whole new concept. We're through with that Assyrian period. We're looking at the future now, and we're going to get into more messianic messages and the remnant that's coming back after this captivity. starting in chapter 40.